questions and discussions are impacting researchers' methods of practice?
So I think right now I'm particularly interested in questions regarding posthumanism and new materialism within what people term the Anthropocene. So this would be understanding both context in which we live our lives and the concepts with which we understand them. I'm interested in them, I must say, because I'm a bit skeptical of them. There is a rush, I think, to these different perspectives, and I want to make sure for myself that I understand them thoroughly before employing them.
So some qualitative researchers are critiquing procedurally driven approaches to methods. There's been discussions of whether we should do away with methods altogether. There's sometimes a binary being set up between radical empiricist approaches to methods and phenomenology. There's the ongoing discussion of anthropocentrism in some forms of qualitative research, as well as ongoing discussions of representationalism.
I mean, the questions that are around, I think, particularly at the moment, and maybe I'm aware of this because I'm at this conference at the moment, that they're to do with ethics, they're to do with politics, they're to do with whether we continue to use the same methods that we've used for a long time, or whether we need to rethink those methods and reconceptualize them completely. So, because the reference to the conference, the European Congress that I'm at the moment, where we're talking, is that there's keynotes about posthumanism, post-qualitative research, rethinking ontology, rethinking how we understand our relations within the people, the subjects, the places, the things that are part of our research. So, and those are ethical and political questions too. And then there are also I think the kind of wider, not wider, but maybe more specific political questions about the role of methods, the role of qualitative research within the current political climate, and what work is it doing, what's its impact upon, I mean impact in a more interesting way than how it's often used in the academy, but the impact of the work that we do in the context of current and future political climates, events. And the ethical questions go along with that too, and with it to do with how we do research in an ethical way within within the world that we live, and I mean world both in terms of geopolitical terms, but also in environmental terms too. So those are all huge questions, and they're all rightly impacting or should be impacting upon research methods.
What new methods of research do you see emerging?
So at Walking Lab, we've been talking about how it's not necessarily new methods that need to be invented, but it's the intentions and the ethical political stance that we bring towards research. And that's what we've been focusing on throughout our book and in our other writings based around Walking Lab.
There's a lot of current conversation about whether we can and should still keep thinking about methods even. So I think that's where a lot of the new work might be done, is in relation to reconceptualizing research, reconceptualizing qualitative research in particular, even more specifically reconceptualizing what we mean by methods within qualitative research, because methods implies a separation between methods and methodology, or methods and question, or methods and ontology, and those are all being questioned, not by everybody by any means, but that's a strong and I think compelling theme of current discourse within qualitative research. So I think the kind of new methods that arise is not quite the question. I think it's what new what reconceptualizing of qualitative inquiry do we see happening? And I think that the answer to that question is, I don't know yet, and we don't know yet. But I think that it will involve reimagining what we mean by the project.
Well, I think particularly in light of things such as the new materialisms or new empiricisms, I think we, as we understand things like interviewing, we have to take into account the environments and context in which they're delivered. So, for example, something as simple, seemingly simple as the interview, we now might understand in relation to something like the walking interview. How might we walk through different spaces of which we're not aware, and becoming lost in thought allows us to become lost in an embodied way, and that might be a very productive way to generate new meaning that otherwise in the standard interview we would not have found. So I am particularly interested in those rather simple practices, methodological practices that betray larger and more layered sense of meaning.
What new methods would you like to see researchers embracing in their work?
I think one thing that I think we need to do is take seriously this materialist turn, and by taking seriously, I think we really need to understand its links, its intersections, and its breaks with historical or conventional methods. So, I often say there's nothing new about materialism, but we have new materialism here. And so we really need to take into strong consideration the philosophical histories that these folks pull from. So, for instance, I've been reading a lot of Rosi Braidotti lately, who, of course, works with the philosopher Spinoza. And when we bring those two together and sort of fold them into themselves, we get particularly interesting elements of meaning. And so I think we need to trace back these different philosophical orientations. So it's a bit of philosophy as method that I think is a sort of emergent element of the field.
So I don't think it's necessarily about new methods. I think it's more about how we treat, in using methods, sometimes treat data as something that is extracted, like it's waiting out there, waiting for us to discover it and remove it. And instead of using methods to do that, at Walking Lab we try to think propositionally about research and create an event through using different methods.
How does posthumanism affect how researchers approach the process of research?
I think posthumanism affects the process of how we do research by recasting, by demanding that we reposition our understanding of where the researcher is in relation to the research and what it is that we're researching. So posthumanism does the work of, amongst much else, decentering the human. It's saying we can no longer sustain living and researching with the notion of the human at the center of everything we do. That's a hugely radical move, and I don't think we've begun really to understand quite what that means for research. And I certainly would say that for myself. I don't quite know how that affects how I do my research, because I feel I can't help but place the human in there as at least a central part of the research project. And I'm not sure yet how to do that differently, and I'm not yet sure on the desirability completely of doing that differently. Like, I think, so I think it's just, it's making us rethink, and I'm not, and I certainly for one, I don't feel like I've landed at where we need to get to with it.
Yeah. Well, posthumanism, I think, as context and method, so it is as the context in which we find ourselves. It is a sort of historical moment. And I'm drawn, I believe I got this from Patty Leather, but the idea of post as standing at one's post as opposed to a temporal sense of post as beyond. So if we are standing at our post, we are recognizing and engaging with all the different elements of humanism around us. So posthumanism is not to forget the human or humanity, but to rather understand how liberal humanism impacts the way in which we think and live, and to see if we can intervene in the otherwise sort of easy delivery of humanism that allows us to understand how we're intersecting with different environments, how we're coming out of these different ecologically based elements that help us to generate meaning. And so with posthumanism, we order meaning in particular ways, I think, that hold us accountable to the non-human or the environmental in different ways than we have dealt with in the past.
So in the humanities and the social sciences, posthumanism has been proliferating quite extensively as researchers think about new methodologies. One of the things that we take up in our book, though, and here we draw on other feminist and critical race scholars, is that there's been a tendency that posthumanism has started to attend to all matter as if it's all equal. So we're starting to see what people are calling a flattened ontology. So we have specifically focused on the ways that walking methodologies can become more accountable to both posthumanism, but also informed like intersectionally with critical race theory, queer trans theory, feminist theory, and very specifically because we are white settlers in Canada, we've been using a lot of Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous scholars' work for our book.
Are traditional definitions of ethical research practices changing?
I believe they absolutely are. Traditionally, or in conventional research, our ethical deliberations were sort of very human-based, so they were stuck to sort of what are the ways in which we make claims about the individual subject, which was entirely human. Now we have to understand the ethical, I think, in a relational way. So ethics don't precede the moment of methodological engagement. They grow out of the moment of inaction, of methodological inaction. So the whole notion of the ethical is now intersects in relational and particularly productive ways.
I think the way in which people, researchers understand ethics really has to do with their sort of epistemological and ontological kind of framework, the theoretical framework that they're approaching. And so because we've been using like a critical post-humanist or more than human understanding of ethics, for us we draw on a lot of work by, so because we've been really focused on a critical post-human approach to ethics, we draw on scholars like Sarah Ahmed, who talks about an ethics of citational practices, Donna Haraway, who talks about situated knowledges, inheritances, accountability, and of course Rosie Bray-Dotty, who talks about sort of a feminist affirmative politics of ethics. So these are ethics that are about relationality. Because we're doing walking, we also have drawn on Stacey Alamo's notion of an ethics of place, because thinking about the actual situated location of where walking takes place. And here we also draw on Indigenous scholars like Vanessa Watt, who talks about the relationship of land and that importance to sort of knowledge making.
I'm not sure that they are in terms of how much qualitative research with human subjects is conducted, but I think there's a rethinking that many are doing about ethics and what ethics means, and about a rethinking of the kind of very, I think, Gilliman and Gillam talk about procedural ethics as opposed to, so the procedural ethics feels very static in how universities, for example, are conceptualizing ethics and what that means in a very kind of, it's done in a very instrumentalized way. But I think the work that Gilliman and Gillam did with that was from back in the early 2000s, but a lot since then has been to rethink about ethics as being a process, as ethics as being something that's happening all the time in all the relationships that are occurring within research. So I'm not sure that it is being I'm not sure on what impact that's having on the way in which institutions are thinking about their ethics processes, but certainly thinking ethically and working ethically and researching ethically is changing, I would say.